Sarah Bennett stood at the entrance of Blue Sky Private Aviation Terminal, her designer briefcase clutched in one hand and her phone in the other. At 35, she had worked tirelessly to reach her position as CFO of Goldman Investment Partners, one of New York's most prestigious financial firms. The early morning sun reflected off the sleek private jets parked on the tarmac, a sight she had grown accustomed to over the past 5 years of her career. Her dark brown hair was neatly pulled back into a professional bun, and her navy blue suit was perfectly pressed. A presentation that had become second nature after years in the corporate world. She glanced at her watch, 7:15 a.m. She was early for her 8 a.m. flight to Chicago, where she would be leading negotiations for a billion-dollar merger. "Another beautiful day for flying," remarked Thomas, the regular morning receptionist, as he buzzed her through the first set of glass doors. Sarah smiled warmly at him, a familiar morning exchange, a comfortable routine. Thomas had been working at the terminal for over a decade and knew most of the regular executive travelers by name. "Good morning, Thomas. How's Amy doing with her college applications?" Sarah asked, remembering their conversation from last week about his daughter. This was typical of Sarah. Despite her high-powered position, she always took time to know the people around her. "She just got accepted to Cornell." Thomas beamed proudly. "Thank you for those tips about the alumni interview. They really helped." Sarah was about to respond when she noticed something different about the security checkpoint ahead. Instead of Mike, the usual security guard who had been working there for years, there was a new face, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and cold eyes. His name tag read James Miller. As Sarah approached the security checkpoint, she noticed Miller's eyes narrow slightly. She had seen that look before, the subtle shift in expression that usually preceded an unpleasant encounter. Still, she maintained her professional demeanor, reaching for her ID and flight documentation. "Good morning," Sarah said pleasantly, extending her credentials. "I'm here for the 8 a.m. flight to Chicago." Miller barely glanced at her documents before his face hardened. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that made several nearby travelers turn their heads. Sarah took a deep breath, all too familiar with what was unfolding. "Yes, I'm certain. I fly from this terminal twice a week. Here's my company ID, pilot clearance, and government identification." Miller picked up her documents, making a show of examining each one with exaggerated scrutiny. Meanwhile, he waved through two white executives who had just arrived, barely glancing at their credentials. "These could be fake," Miller said loudly enough for others to hear. "We have very high standards here. This is a private aviation terminal, not a commercial airport." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but years of dealing with boardroom tensions helped her maintain her composure. She noticed several people had stopped to watch the interaction, some with concerned expressions, others pretending not to notice. "I understand your need to be thorough," Sarah replied calmly, "but I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years. You can verify my credentials with Thomas at the front desk or check the regular passenger registry." Miller crossed his arms. "I don't care if you've been coming here for 20 years. Today, I need additional verification. Maybe a call to your supposed company?" Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand, a message from her assistant confirming that the Chicago team was already gathering for the morning's meeting. She couldn't afford to be late, but she also knew she couldn't let this discrimination go unchallenged. Discreetly, she pressed the record button on her phone, letting it capture the unfolding scene. She had learned from experience that documentation was often the key to addressing such situations. "Of course," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Please feel free to call Goldman Investment Partners. I'm the chief financial officer there. You can also check with the flight crew. I flew with them just last week." As Miller continued to create obstacles, Sarah noticed one of her regular pilot crew members, Captain Rodriguez, walking through the terminal doors. A small sense of relief washed over her. Finally, someone who could verify her identity was arriving. But the fact that she needed such validation when other executives walked through freely highlighted exactly why this encounter needed to be documented and addressed. Little did Miller know, his actions that morning would spark a chain of events that would change not just his own future, but the policies of private aviation terminals across the country. The tension at the security checkpoint continued to build as Captain Rodriguez approached. He immediately recognized the uncomfortable scene unfolding before him. Sarah Bennett was one of his most frequent passengers, and the hostile stance of the new security guard, James Miller, was impossible to miss. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Rodriguez asked, his experienced eyes taking in the situation. He had been flying private jets for 15 years and had never seen Sarah have any issues at security before. Miller straightened his uniform, his demeanor shifting slightly at the pilot's presence. "I'm just doing my jobs, sir. This person claims to be a CFO and wants access to the private terminal. I'm conducting a thorough security check." Sarah's phone continued recording as Miller emphasized the word person with obvious disdain. Through the glass walls of the terminal, she could see her jet being prepared for takeoff, the ground crew efficiently going about their morning routine. "This person," Captain Rodriguez replied firmly, "is Sarah Bennett, CFO of Goldman Investment Partners. She flies with us twice a week. I can personally vouch for her identity." Miller's face reddened, but he stood his ground. "With all due respect, Captain, security protocols require me to verify everyone's identity independently. We can't make exceptions." Interesting. A new voice joined the conversation. Michael Chen, CEO of a tech company and another regular at the terminal, had been watching the scene unfold while pretending to check his phone. "I just walked through 5 minutes ago, and you barely looked at my ID." Sarah noticed other travelers had stopped pretending not to watch. Some had their phones out, quietly recording the incident. Thomas, the receptionist, was on the phone, his concerned expression suggesting he was likely contacting terminal management. "The difference in treatment is quite obvious," Michael continued, his voice carrying across the now quiet terminal. "I've seen Ms. Bennett here more times than I can count. She's one of the most respected executives in New York's financial sector." Miller's face grew redder. "I'm just following procedures." "Which procedures exactly?" Sarah asked calmly, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "Could you please show me the specific protocol that requires such extensive verification for some passengers but not others?" A woman in a business suit who had passed through security earlier approached the group. "I'm recording this too," she announced. "I've been flying from this terminal for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone treated this way. This is clearly discriminatory behavior." The main terminal door opened, and a man in a suit hurried in. From his badge, Sarah could see he was Mr. Harrison, the terminal's operations manager. Thomas must have called him. "What's going on here?" Harrison asked, looking between Miller and the growing crowd of onlookers. Before Miller could speak, Michael Chen stepped forward. "Your new security guard has spent the last 15 minutes preventing Ms. Bennett from accessing her flight, despite multiple forms of identification and verification from Captain Rodriguez. Meanwhile, several other executives, myself included, were waved through with minimal checking." Harrison's face grew serious as he turned to Miller. "Is this true?" "Sir, I was just being thorough," Miller began, but Harrison cut him off. "Being thorough doesn't mean being discriminatory," Harrison stated firmly. He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Bennett, please accept my sincere apologies for this incident. Please proceed to your flight. Captain Rodriguez, please ensure Ms. Bennett reaches her aircraft safely." As Sarah walked past the security checkpoint, Miller stood rigid, his face a mask of barely contained anger. She could hear Harrison behind her, saying, "Mr. Miller, come with me to my office immediately." Several passengers approached Sarah as she walked toward her gate, offering their contact information as witnesses. Michael Chen fell into step beside her. "This needs to go further than just a reprimand," he said quietly. "I've heard rumors about similar incidents at other terminals. Having prominent executives as witnesses might help push for real change." Sarah nodded, stopping to check her phone. The recording was safe, and she had already forwarded it to her assistant with instructions to send it to their legal department. The time showed 7:45 a.m. She would still make her meeting in Chicago, but this morning had turned into something much bigger than a routine flight. As she walked toward her jet with Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's mind was already formulating a plan. This incident would not be swept under the rug. It was time for the private aviation industry to face its prejudices head-on. As Sarah's private jet cruised at 30,000 feet toward Chicago, she couldn't focus on her merger documents. The morning's events kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to her company's legal department, attaching the video recording of the incident. Meanwhile, back at the Blue Sky Private Aviation Terminal, Things were heating up in Operations Manager Harrison's office. Miller sat stiffly in a chair, his security badge removed and placed on Harrison's desk. "Would you care to explain your actions this morning?" Harrison asked, his normally friendly face stern with disappointment. "We've already received 6 witness statements about your treatment of Ms. Bennett, not to mention multiple recordings." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, I was just following security protocols. You can't blame me for being careful about who we let into private aviation facilities." "Careful?" Harrison's voice rose slightly. "You let 3 other executives through with barely a glance at their IDs. The only difference was their skin color. That's not being careful, Mr. Miller. That's discrimination." Before Miller could respond, Harrison's phone buzzed. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Sir, CNN is on line 1. They're asking for a comment about a viral video showing discriminatory treatment at our terminal." Miller's face went pale. Harrison picked up the phone. "Tell them we'll issue a statement shortly." He turned back to Miller. "The video has already gone viral. Do you understand the severity of what you've done?" In Chicago, Sarah's phone was flooding with notifications. The video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. #PrivateJetWildlack was trending, and major news outlets were picking up the story. Her assistant had forwarded her an email from Goldman Investment Partners CEO, Richard Goldman. "Sarah, just saw the video. This is unacceptable. We're calling an emergency board meeting. We're not just your employers. We're going to be your allies in this fight." Back in New York, Michael Chen was making calls of his own. As a prominent figure in the tech industry, his witness account carried weight. He had already spoken to 3 other CEOs who regularly used private aviation services, and they were all equally outraged. "This isn't an isolated incident," Michael explained to a reporter over the phone. "We've heard whispers about similar discrimination at other terminals, but this time we have clear evidence. And more importantly, we have a victim who has the power and resources to fight back." In Harrison's office, the situation was getting worse for Miller. Security footage from the past week had been pulled up, showing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Several minority passengers had faced excessive scrutiny, while white passengers were waved through quickly. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately," Harrison announced. "But I have a feeling this won't be the end of it." Miller finally showed some emotion, his face contorting with anger. "You can't fire me for doing my job. I was protecting the terminal." "Protecting it from what exactly?" Harrison asked sharply. "From successful executives like Ms. Bennett, from legitimate passengers who happen to be minorities. Your prejudice has not only hurt innocent people, but it's also damaged our terminal's reputation." As if to emphasize his point, Harrison's computer chimed with another email. The National Aviation Authority was launching an investigation into discriminatory practices at private aviation terminals nationwide, using the morning's incident as a catalyst. Sarah's plane was beginning its descent into Chicago when she received a text from Thomas, the receptionist. "Miss Bennett, thought you should know. Miller's been fired, but more importantly, your stand is making waves. 3 other minority executives have already come forward with similar stories from other terminals. You've started something important." Sarah looked out the window at the Chicago skyline emerging through the clouds. What had started as a routine business trip had turned into something much bigger. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mother. "Baby, I just saw the video," the message read. "I'm so proud of how you handled yourself. Your father would have been proud too. You're turning this horrible experience into a chance for real change." As the plane touched down in Chicago, Sarah took a deep breath. She had an important merger meeting ahead, but she knew that her next few weeks would involve more than just business deals. Sometimes leadership meant taking a stand, and she was ready for the challenge. The incident at Blue Sky Terminal was about to become a turning point in the private aviation industry's approach to diversity and discrimination, and Sarah Bennett, despite never asking for this role, was ready to be at the forefront of that change. 3 days after the incident at Blue Sky Terminal, Sarah sat in her New York office, surrounded by a team of lawyers and civil rights advocates. The story had exploded beyond anything she could have imagined. Her video had been viewed over 5 million times, and similar incidents were being reported at private terminals across the country. "The evidence is overwhelming," said Patricia Martinez, a prominent civil rights attorney who had taken a special interest in the case. We've received 43 testimonials from minority executives describing similar experiences at private aviation terminals. Your video gave them the courage to come forward. Sarah's assistant knocked and entered the office. Miss Bennett, CNN is ready for your live interview in 10 minutes. And Mr. Goldman wants to remind you that the company fully supports your decision to speak out. The past few days had been a whirlwind. After successfully closing the merger deal in Chicago, Sarah had returned to find herself at the center of a national conversation about discrimination in elite spaces. James Miller, the fired security guard, had made things worse for himself by giving an unapologetic interview to a local news station. I was just doing what many others do quietly, Miller had said in the interview. I'm being punished for being obvious about it. His words had only added fuel to the fire, prompting more terminals to examine their security practices. Sarah straightened her jacket as she walked toward the office's media room. She had done countless financial presentations, but this would be different. This was personal. We're live in 3, 2, 1, the producer signaled. Good morning, I'm Jessica Chen with CNN, the anchor began. We're here with Sarah Bennett, the CFO whose discriminatory treatment at a private aviation terminal has sparked a national debate. Ms. Bennett, thank you for joining us. Sarah spoke clearly and confidently. Thank you for having me, Jessica. What happened to me is unfortunately not unique. The only difference is that this time, it was caught on video, and I had the resources and support to fight back. Meanwhile, at Blue Sky Terminal, changes were already happening. Operations Manager Harrison was overseeing the installation of new security cameras with audio recording capabilities. All security interactions would now be monitored and reviewed regularly for bias. Thomas, the receptionist who had first called Harrison during the incident, was being promoted to head of customer relations, a new position created specifically to handle passenger complaints and ensure equal treatment. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, Harrison explained to a group of reporters. But more importantly, we're creating clear accountability measures. What happened to Ms. Bennett will never happen here again. Back in Sarah's office after the CNN interview, her phone rang. It was Michael Chen, the CEO, who had witnessed the incident. Sarah, we're making progress, he said excitedly. 5 major private aviation companies have agreed to form an oversight committee. They want you to lead it. Sarah smiled, remembering how her father, one of the first black commercial airline pilots in the 1970s, had faced similar discrimination. He had always told her that change happens when good people refuse to stay silent. Her computer pinged with a new email. The National Aviation Authority was proposing new guidelines for private terminals, including regular audits for discriminatory practices and heavy fines for violations. They wanted her input on the draft. Ms. Bennett, her assistant, called from the door. The terminal's parent company wants to schedule a meeting. They're proposing a complete overhaul of their security protocols and want her recommendations. Sarah looked at the framed photo on her desk. Her father in his pilot's uniform, standing proud despite the challenges he had faced. She thought about how he had paved the way for others, just as she was doing now. The incident with Miller had been painful and humiliating, but it had cracked open a door that had been closed for too long. Behind that door were decades of similar stories, all waiting to be told. As she prepared for her next meeting, Sarah received a text from Captain Rodriguez. Just heard about the new oversight committee. The crews are celebrating. You've started something important here. Sarah took a deep breath. This wasn't the kind of leadership she had expected to provide when she became CFO, but sometimes life chose your battles for you. The important thing was how you fought them. The next few months would be busy, balancing her CFO duties with her new role as an advocate for change. But looking at her father's picture, she knew it would be worth it. Sometimes the biggest changes started with one person simply refusing to be silent. 1 week after the incident, the story took an unexpected turn. A young woman named Jennifer Torres, who worked as a data analyst at Blue Sky Terminal, came forward with a shocking revelation. She had access to the terminal's security logs and had discovered something disturbing about James Miller's employment history. I couldn't stay quiet anymore, Jennifer explained to Sarah during a private meeting in Goldman Investment Partners' conference room. Miller wasn't just a random security guard. He was transferred here after similar incidents at 3 other aviation facilities. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her expression serious. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the sound of Jennifer nervously shuffling through documents she had brought with her. "Look at these records," Jennifer continued, spreading papers across the conference table. "In the past 5 years, Miller was moved from terminal to terminal after complaints, but nothing was ever documented officially. They just kept passing the problem along." Sarah's legal team, already present in the room, began examining the documents. Patricia Martinez, her civil rights attorney, let out a low whistle. "This is bigger than we thought. This shows a systemic pattern of covering up discriminatory behavior across multiple facilities." Meanwhile, across town, James Miller was giving another interview, but this time his tone had changed. Having learned about Jennifer's evidence, he was now trying to shift blame. "I was just following unofficial policies," he claimed to a reporter. "Management knew exactly what was happening. They gave us unofficial profiles to watch out for. I'm being used as a scapegoat." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Michael Chen. "Have you seen Miller's new interview? He's throwing everyone under the bus. This could expose the whole system." Back in her office, Sarah called an emergency meeting with her growing team of advocates and legal experts. The room quickly filled with determined faces, all ready to tackle this expanding challenge. "This isn't just about one security guard anymore," Sarah addressed the group. "Jennifer's evidence shows a pattern of discrimination being quietly shuffled around instead of addressed. We need to go bigger." Patricia Martinez nodded in agreement. "We should file a class action lawsuit. With Jennifer's documents and Miller's new statements, we can target the entire private aviation security system." As they discussed strategy, Sarah's assistant rushed in with breaking news. Other whistleblowers from different terminals were starting to come forward. Inspired by Jennifer's courage, the story was growing by the hour. Thomas, now in his new role as head of customer relations at Blue Sky Terminal, sent Sarah an urgent message. More employees want to speak out. They have similar stories from other terminals. This could change everything. The next morning, major news networks were running headlines about the expanding scandal. "Discrimination in the sky is a systemic problem exposed blazed across TV screens nationwide." Sarah sat in her office, watching the coverage while on a conference call with aviation industry leaders. The tone had changed dramatically from the previous week. Now, instead of damage control, they were talking about real reform. "We need a complete overhaul," one aviation executive admitted. "Miss Bennett, your experience and Jennifer's evidence have exposed problems we can't ignore anymore. Will you help us fix this?" Jennifer Torres, who had risked her job to expose the truth, was now being hailed as a hero by civil rights organizations. She had already received job offers from companies impressed by her integrity, including one from Goldman Investment Partners. Operations Manager Harrison called Sarah that afternoon. "I had no idea about Miller's history," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "The system was designed to hide these problems, even from people like me who thought we were doing the right thing." Sarah looked out her office window at the New York skyline. What had started as one discriminatory incident had uncovered a network of systemic racism that had been operating in the shadows for years. Her father's words came back to her. Sometimes it takes one crack to bring down the whole wall. The crack she had exposed was revealing just how deep the problems went. As the day drew to a close, Sarah received an email from the National Aviation Authority. They were launching a comprehensive investigation into hiring and transfer practices at all private aviation facilities nationwide. The story had evolved from one security guard's actions into an exposure of industry-wide discrimination. But more importantly, it had given others the courage to speak up and fight for change. The wall of silence was finally crumbling, one brave voice at a time. 2 weeks into the investigation, Sarah Bennett found herself sitting in a packed congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. The private aviation discrimination scandal had caught the attention of lawmakers, and she had been called to testify alongside Jennifer Torres and several other witnesses. The room was silent as Sarah approached the microphone. Camera flashes lit up the room, and she could see the serious faces of congressional representatives looking down at her from their elevated seats. "Ms. Bennett," began Congresswoman Martinez, "please tell us about the events that led to this investigation." Sarah spoke clearly into the microphone, her voice steady and strong. What started as one incident of discrimination has revealed a nationwide pattern of prejudice in private aviation. Thanks to brave whistleblowers like Jennifer Torres, we now know this wasn't just about one security guard or one terminal. In New York, James Miller watched the hearing on TV from his lawyer's office. His face grew pale as Jennifer Torres took the stand next, armed with even more documents than she had initially revealed. We have records showing at least 28 incidents where discriminatory behavior was reported, Jennifer testified, her voice gaining confidence with each word. In every case, the offending employee was simply transferred to another facility. No investigations, no consequences. Back at Blue Sky Terminal, Operations Manager Harrison was implementing sweeping changes. New security cameras were being installed, and a diverse panel of community members had been appointed to oversee security practices. "We can't change the past," Harrison told his staff during a training session, "but we can make sure we're part of the solution moving forward." The hearing continued as more witnesses came forward. A former security supervisor from another terminal revealed the existence of unofficial watch lists that targeted minority passengers. A human resources manager admitted to helping shuffle problem employees between facilities to avoid negative publicity. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Your father would be so proud. This is exactly what he fought for, making spaces fair for everyone." During a break in the hearing, Sarah spoke with Michael Chen in the hallway. "The aviation industry will never be the same after this," he said, showing her the latest news on his tablet. Major airlines were already announcing new diversity and inclusion initiatives, afraid of being caught up in the growing scandal. Back in the hearing room, Congressman Thompson addressed the panel. "What we're seeing here is not just individual bias, but a systemic failure to protect all citizens' rights. This committee is prepared to take decisive action." The committee revealed their proposed legislation, the Aviation Equal Access Act. The bill would require mandatory bias training for all aviation personnel, regular audits of security practices, a national database to track discrimination complaints, heavy fines for facilities that fail to report incidents, protection for whistleblowers who expose discrimination. James Miller's lawyer called him later that day. "They want you to testify too," she said. "If you cooperate and tell them everything about the unofficial policies, they might be lenient." Miller sat in silence for a long moment. His world had completely unraveled in just a few weeks. Finally, he nodded. "I'll tell them everything." Sarah returned to her hotel room that evening exhausted but hopeful. Her phone was full of messages from other executives sharing their own stories of discrimination. The wall of silence was crumbling faster than anyone had expected. Thomas sent her a photo from Blue Sky Terminal, the new diverse security team starting their first day of training. "Change is happening," his message read. "Thank you for starting it." Jennifer Torres, who had been sitting next to Sarah during the hearing, had received a standing ovation for her testimony. She had already accepted a position with a civil rights organization where she would help other whistleblowers come forward. As Sarah prepared for bed, she received one last message from Captain Rodriguez. "Just flew my first flight under the new security protocols. Every passenger treated with respect, no exceptions. You did this, Sarah. You made this happen." She looked out her hotel window at the Washington Monument lit up against the night sky. The aviation industry was finally facing its demons, and real change was happening. Sometimes it took one person standing firm in their truth to start a revolution. Tomorrow would bring more testimonies, more revelations, and more steps toward justice. But tonight, Sarah could rest knowing that her father's dream of equality in aviation was finally moving closer to reality. 1 month after the congressional hearing, the Aviation Equal Access Act was signed into law. Sarah Bennett stood in the White House Rose Garden, watching as the president put pen to paper, making history for civil rights in the aviation industry. James Miller's full testimony had become a turning point in the investigation. He had revealed names, dates, and details of the unofficial discriminatory policies that had existed for years. His cooperation had exposed dozens of executives who had helped cover up discrimination cases. "I was wrong," Miller had admitted during his testimony. "I didn't just follow bad orders, I chose to follow them. I hurt people like Ms. Bennett because of my own prejudices, and I'm ready to face the consequences." Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Jennifer Torres. who was now heading the newly created Aviation Equality Watch, an organization dedicated to monitoring discrimination in the industry. First day of nationwide mandatory bias training. You should see how many people are coming forward with their stories. At Blue Sky Terminal, the changes were dramatic. Operations Manager Harrison had assembled the most diverse security team in private aviation history. The new team included people of different races, ages, and backgrounds, all trained under the strict new anti-discrimination protocols. Ms. Bennett, Thomas called out as Sarah entered the terminal for her first flight since the incident. "Look at this." He proudly pointed to a large screen displaying real-time statistics of security checks, showing that all passengers were being screened equally, regardless of their appearance. Michael Chen met Sarah at the security checkpoint, where a new guard, Maria Rodriguez, checked their IDs with professional courtesy. "Remember when we stood here a month ago?" he asked. Amazing how much can change when people decide to do the right thing. The National Aviation Authority had created a new division specifically focused on equality in aviation. They had hired Sarah as a special advisor, and she would split her time between her CFO duties and helping implement the new regulations. In the terminal's break room, a group of security guards watched a training video featuring Sarah's story. One of them, a young black woman, turned to her colleagues. "This is why I felt confident applying for this job. They're finally taking us seriously." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with news that would bring tears to her eyes. The National Aviation Hall of Fame had decided to create a new wing dedicated to pioneers who fought discrimination in aviation. Her father's photo would be among the first displayed. "Your father started this fight," her mother told her over the phone. "And you finished it. He always said the sky should be free of prejudice because up there, we're all just human beings." The influence of the changes spread beyond private aviation. Commercial airlines began adopting similar transparency measures. Security companies started recruiting from more diverse backgrounds. Other industries took notice and began examining their own practices. James Miller, who had pleaded guilty to civil rights violations, was sentenced to community service and ordered to work with anti-discrimination organizations. His testimony had helped bring down several high-ranking executives who had perpetuated the discriminatory system. Jennifer Torres received an award from the Civil Rights Association for her role in exposing the scandal. "None of this would have happened if Sarah Bennett hadn't stood her ground that morning," she said in her acceptance speech. "She showed us that one person's courage can change an entire industry." At the end of a long day of meetings about implementing the new law, Sarah sat in her office looking at old photos. There was her father in his pilot's uniform, standing proudly despite the discrimination he had faced. Next to it, a new photo showed Sarah with the diverse team at Blue Sky Terminal. Captain Rodriguez knocked on her door. "Ready for tomorrow's flight?" he asked. "The new security team is excited to show you how things have changed." Sarah smiled, gathering her things. As she walked through the terminal, she saw people of all backgrounds moving freely, treated with equal respect. The fear and tension that had once filled these spaces was gone, replaced by professional courtesy and genuine equality. A young black girl watched wide-eyed as Sarah walked past. Her mother whispered something in her ear, and the girl's face lit up with recognition. Sarah stopped to say hello, remembering how much it would have meant to her younger self to see someone like her in a position of power. The aviation industry would never be perfect, but it had taken a giant step toward justice, and sometimes that's how progress works. One brave stand, one exposed truth, one changed mind at a time. 1 year after the incident that changed private aviation, Sarah Bennett stood at a podium in New York's largest convention center. Behind her, a banner read, "First Annual Aviation Equality Summit." The room was packed with industry leaders, civil rights advocates, and aviation professionals from around the world. "A year ago, I was just trying to board a flight," Sarah began her keynote speech. "Today, we're celebrating changes that many thought impossible. But this isn't just my story anymore. It belongs to everyone who stood up for what's right." In the audience, James Miller sat quietly in the back row. After serving his sentence and completing extensive rehabilitation programs, he had become an unexpected advocate for change, speaking to security teams about recognizing and overcoming their biases. Jennifer Torres, now a respected figure in aviation equality, sat in the front row. Her organization, Aviation Equality Watch had documented a 95% decrease in discrimination complaints since the new laws took effect. She smiled as Sarah acknowledged her role in the transformation. The numbers tell an incredible story, Sarah continued, pointing to the screen behind her. In just 1 year, minority employment in aviation security has increased by 300%. Customer satisfaction is at an all-time high, but most importantly, everyone can now travel with dignity. Thomas, who had been promoted to National Director of Customer Relations, nodded from his seat. He had helped implement similar changes at terminals across the country, using Blue Sky as a model of success. Michael Chen stood up to share his part of the story. What we witnessed that day wasn't just discrimination. We saw courage. Sarah showed us that speaking up can change not just one incident, but an entire industry. The convention center screens played a montage of the year's achievements. New diverse security teams at terminals nationwide, training programs teaching bias recognition, award ceremonies honoring whistleblowers, and testimonials from passengers who had experienced the positive changes. Sarah's father's photo appeared on the screen, alongside other aviation pioneers who had fought discrimination. The audience rose in a standing ovation, recognizing the legacy of those who had paved the way. Operations Manager Harrison, now the National Director of Aviation Security Standards, shared the latest statistics. Every terminal in the country now has 24-hour monitoring, transparent reporting, and diverse oversight committees. We've created a system where discrimination simply cannot hide. Captain Rodriguez spoke about changes in the cockpit. Our crews are more diverse than ever. Young people who never saw themselves in aviation are now applying to flight school in record numbers. As the summit continued, Sarah received a message from her mother. Just boarded a private flight for my vacation. The security guard was so professional, she reminded me of you. This is the world your father dreamed of. James Miller approached Sarah during the lunch break. I can never fully make up for what I did, he said quietly. But I spend every day trying to help others unlearn the prejudices I held. Thank you for helping me see the truth. The summit included workshops on maintaining the progress made and planning for future challenges. Industry leaders signed new commitments to diversity and inclusion, backed by substantial financial investments. A young security guard from Blue Sky Terminal shared her story. I never thought I could have this career, she said. Ms. Bennett didn't just change rules, she changed what people like me believe is possible. As the day drew to a close, Sarah made one final announcement. Today, we're launching the Aviation Equality Scholarship Fund. Every year, we'll help minority students pursue careers in aviation, ensuring this industry continues to grow more diverse and inclusive. The audience erupted in applause as Sarah revealed that every major aviation company had contributed to the fund, creating opportunities for generations to come. Later that evening, Sarah stood at Blue Sky Terminal, watching planes take off against the sunset. A year ago, she had stood in the same spot, facing discrimination. Now, she watched as passengers of all backgrounds moved through security with equal treatment and respect. Thomas joined her by the window. You know what's amazing, he said. The new normal is so natural now, people forget how it used to be. That's real change. Sarah smiled, thinking of her father's words. The sky belongs to everyone. Finally, the aviation industry was living up to that truth. As she prepared to board her own flight, Sarah knew that while one chapter of the story had ended, the work of maintaining and building upon these changes would continue. And somewhere out there, her father was smiling down on a transformed industry that now truly welcomed everyone.